Hello, I'm Kevin Tearley from Taxonomy Australia and the Australian Academy of Science. This video is an introduction to a process to prepare for launch what may be one of the most important science missions of our generation, a mission to discover and document all remaining Australian species in a generation, in 25 years. This meeting was originally going to be a national face-to-face meeting in Adelaide in mid-March of 2020. Unfortunately, at very late notice, we needed to cancel that meeting because of the rapidly evolving coronavirus crisis and the decision by many institutions to prevent travel from their staff to ensure their safety. So instead of a national face-to-face meeting, the plan is to run a process over the next several weeks to achieve the same outcomes that we would have achieved over 3 days in Adelaide face-to-face. We're going to run a series of online presentations, workshops, video conferences, and get into working groups and work by email and through Google Docs to achieve the same ends, which is to work out how on earth we can go about doing this. The purpose of this video is to set the scene, set the context, and to outline the aims and what we'd like to achieve through this series of meetings. So the key issues are as follows. Best estimates are that in 200 years of taxonomy and systematics in Australia through Western science, we've discovered and documented and named around 30% of the estimated number of species in Australia. So 70% of our species remain undiscovered, undocumented, unnamed, and effectively invisible. I think this is a real problem in the age of the Anthropocene. We're dealing with incredible threats to biodiversity through global warming, global change, global pollution. There are many threats, and yet 70% of our map of Australia's biodiversity is effectively blank. How do we manage these threats to biodiversity when much of our biodiversity, a majority of our biodiversity, is invisible? Now, there are two things I think we need not to discuss in this meeting. The first is whether it's a good idea to do this, and the second is whether it's achievable. I think instead we need to imagine that we're in something like the Manhattan Project. We've been directed by government to achieve this mission, and our task is simply to work out how. So in this video, I'm not going to describe why we think it's important to do this. Clearly that case needs to be made when we begin advocating to government, industry and the community for the importance of this process, of this mission, but the why will come at that time. In this meeting, in this series of meetings, we're talking about the how. Now, it's also going to be incredibly important to think creatively around this problem. At current rate, with business as usual taxonomy, we estimate it will take 4 centuries to complete our documentation of Australia's biodiversity. To bring that down to 25 years means we need to achieve a 16-fold increase on average. For some taxonomic groups, we need to achieve a substantially greater increase. I'm afraid that business as usual simply won't cut it. And if anyone thinks that it will be possible to advocate to government, industry and the community for a 16-fold increase in the number of taxonomists, each of whom continues with business as usual, well, I just don't think that's achievable. Now, fortunately, maths is on our side here. There are 3 factors that determine the average species discovery rate in Australia: the number of taxonomists, the amount of time each taxonomist spends doing taxonomy, and the productivity per taxonomist per unit time. And these are multipliers. So if, for instance, we could double the number of taxonomists, double the amount of time that each taxonomist spends doing taxonomy, and double the productivity per taxonomist, then we've got an 8-fold increase in the number of species discovered per year. We need a 16-fold increase, of course, but we can do this by slicing and dicing these factors in various ways and putting them together to gain this increase. Another important thing is for each of us to think outside our own taxonomic group. One of the things I was planning to do at the national meeting was to bring in at the beginning of the meeting a box with 40 ping pong balls, one for each person, and to chuck it into the middle of the room and get each person to pick up a ball on which would be written the name of a taxonomic group. insects, algae, fungi, plants, mammals, marine invertebrates, etc. Then I was going to ask that if anyone picked up a ping pong ball with a group that corresponded to what they work on, I was going to ask people to swap it with someone so that everyone has a group other than their own. And I was going to ask people effectively to champion the group that was written on their ping pong ball. That is, to think outside their own narrow taxonomic scope and specialty. The aim of the whole exercise was to try to get people thinking about biodiversity as a whole rather than thinking within their own biodiversity. The other thing we need to think very carefully about is hyperdiversity. We can essentially divide taxonomic groups into three categories. There are the categories that are not necessarily particularly diverse, but are very well known and have been documented extremely well. This includes things like flowering plants, vertebrates, some insect groups like butterflies and dragonflies. Then there are taxonomic groups that are hyperdiverse and extremely poorly known. This includes many insect groups such as flies, moths, beetles. It includes nematodes, fungi, and some marine groups. Extremely diverse, extremely poorly known. The third group is sort of intermediate between the two. Taxonomic groups that aren't particularly diverse, don't have all that many species, but are very understudied, and hence a lot of taxonomy still needs to be done. But if you dig a little deeper, you're going to quickly find that even in a place like this, there are many thousands of undiscovered species. If you think about fungi in the soil, endophytic fungi in the plants, if you think about the less prominent insects, beetles, parasitoid wasps, if you think about nematodes in the soil and in the plants, there will be literally thousands of species here that we still don't know about. It's these hyperdiverse groups that are going to be our main challenge. So, groups that are pretty in your face are pretty well known. Groups that are not are very poorly known. But of course, in your faceness isn't a good surrogate or indicator of ecological importance. Think again of fungi, nematodes and parasitoid wasps. These are incredibly ecologically important but incredibly poorly known. So our challenge in this process is to think hard about both the hyperdiverse and the hypodiverse groups, about those that are very poorly known and those that are quite well known, and to figure out how we can deal with the taxonomy across this wide range of different types of taxonomic groups. The other important context for this meeting is the Decadal Plan for Taxonomy and Biosystematics in Australia and New Zealand that we developed and released a couple of years ago. It was during the development of the Decadal Plan that we estimated that 70% of our current species are still undocumented. I'll talk a bit more about the Decadal Plan using some PowerPoint slides to show the context here. So here's the Decadal Plan, a high-level document that sets the context and provides the background for our mission. The Decadal Plan describes the achievements of the taxonomy and biosystematics sector in Australia and New Zealand. It outlines the current state of play, where we're at, what resources we have, and the trend lines in our discipline. It sets out the value proposition for taxonomy and biosystematics, with examples to illustrate the important benefits that come from thoroughly documenting our biodiversity, and it discusses challenges and opportunities in our sector. It ends with a series of 22 strategic actions grouped under 6 key initiatives. Strategic Action 1.1 is as follows. We will significantly increase the rate at which new species in Australia and New Zealand are discovered, resolved, named and documented. This strategic action is what this series of meetings will be all about. Since the release of the Decadal Plan, we've worked further on this, the result being our proposed mission to discover and document all remaining Australian species in a generation. When you think about it, it's not surprising that this is the first strategic action. It's the most important, and in many ways all of the other strategic actions in the Decadal Plan support this one. Other key strategic actions that are relevant are also shown here. For example, Strategic Action 1.2 is about expanding opportunities for collecting in the field, something we'll clearly need to do if we set about discovering and documenting all remaining species. Strategic Action 1.3 is about phylogeny, building the framework that will allow us to understand the evolution of our species, and that will be a key tool in species discovery. Strategic Action 2.1 is about creating a comprehensive, integrated and accessible identification or diagnostics capability for Australian biodiversity. When you think about it, diagnostics and species discovery are almost two sides of the same coin. It's impossible to know that a potential new species is new unless we can diagnose it from existing species. And conversely, there's little point discovering and naming a species if no one else can diagnose or identify it. Strategic Action 4.3 is about building the curated sequence databases that will clearly be a critical tool for discovering and documenting new species. In many ways, the process we're embarking on is the development of an implementation plan for Strategic Action 1.1 to put flesh on its bones, including implementation of its supporting strategic actions. The decadal plan and its strategic actions describe where we want to go. This is my attempt to sketch out where we are now. This is a representation of the current taxonomic pipeline. We collect specimens at one end, at the other end name species and other taxa come out. In between, we have a more or less linear set of steps. We curate the specimens in our collection, delimit them into taxa, diagnose, describe and name the taxa, then publish the results. Importantly, it's more or less at the end of the pipeline that we produce results and digitise these into outward-facing products, such as those provided by ABRIS, the Australian Biological Resources Study, and the Atlas of Living Australia. ABRIS also provides modest funding for each step of the process, while the ALA collects digitised specimen records and represents them to the world. This pipeline currently generates around 1,000 new species per annum in Australia, which seems like a lot until you realise that if we stick to that rate, then it will take 4 centuries to complete our task to document Australia's biodiversity. This is just too slow. To speed it up, we need to remove some of the bottlenecks from the pipeline. We also need to wrap the pipeline in enabling technologies, systems and support layers to help us accelerate the documentation of new species. In essence, we need a plan to convert this low throughput taxonomic pipeline into a high throughput one that can support our task to discover and document all remaining Australian species in a generation. That's what this series of meetings is all about.
Finally, a couple of words about the planned outcomes of this process. Clearly, we're not going to be able to discover and document the remaining Australian species in a generation without substantial government, industry and community investment and support. The aim of this meeting, answering the how question, is to allow us to put together the advocacy material and documentation that we need in order to launch an effective and successful advocacy campaign to give us the maximum chance of gaining that investment. Another important part of this process, of course, another important question is the how much question. We can try during this series of meetings to work out how we will go about it, but we still need to tell government how much it's likely to cost. As a parallel process, Deloitte Access Economics has very generously offered to help Taxonomy Australia to do a cost-benefit analysis, a preliminary cost-benefit analysis, to work out both how much it's likely to cost and what the monetary benefits, the economic benefits are likely to be to Australia by having a substantially expanded and accelerated taxonomic documentation of our species. So, looping right back to the beginning, our mission is to work out how on earth we will be able to discover and document the remaining Australian species in a generation. Please engage. This may be one of the most important conversations and questions that we've asked as a taxonomy sector in Australia in a very long time. You can engage through the Taxonomy Australia website at taxonomyaustralia.org.au. If you go to the Our Work section from the main menu, you'll reach a page where the process that we're setting out will be described, and there will be links to presentations, to video conferences, to workshops and other discussion fora, and to the documents that we're building over this time. I'm hoping that we can have as successful a meeting as I'm sure we would have in Adelaide, and we can still gain the outcomes that we need, the tools that we need to advocate to government through this strange situation we find in this coronavirus world. Then let's reinvigorate and revolutionise taxonomy in Australia as we know it. Thanks for listening.